We're reviewing Episode 20, Desertion of the Dinobots, Part 2, this time on Energon Entries. Welcome back to Energon Entries, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Freites, and I hope that this finds you well. I want to thank everybody who is new, everybody who is old to this podcast. It just continues to grow, which kind of blows my mind because I feel like there's so many great people out there doing Transformers work. And so for people to give compliments and say how much they like what I'm doing, it means a lot. Last time we reviewed part 1 of this 2-part episode. And with that, let's get to the episode recap. The episode begins with Spike and Carly arriving on Cybertron through the space bridge, where they immediately face off against Shockwave. After narrowly escaping into Decepticon headquarters, Carly is injured while sabotaging a computer, rendering the space bridge temporarily non-functional. With the Autobots back on Earth shut down, Spike contacts Sparkplug, who guides them toward Wheeljack's old lab where they reunite with Swoop. Swoop explains that the Dinobots have been captured by the Decepticons and taken to the Cybertonium pit. Along the way, Spike, Carly, and Swoop encounter various dangers, but they eventually reach the pit, where they discover that Shockwave has reprogrammed the Dinobots to serve the Decepticons. Carly successfully restores their memories, and the Dinobots help them escape by destroying the Sentinel drones. Sparkplug reroutes the space bridge to land near Autobot headquarters, and despite Shockwave's attempts to stop them, the Dinobots and humans escape back to Earth with a shipment of Cybertonium. The episode ends with Optimus Prime awarding Spike and Carly with honorary Autobot medals, and Grimlock reluctantly agreeing to follow Prime's orders. For now. So we now have part 2 of this, of course, and somebody did tell me last week as I posted this on YouTube, or at least the audio on YouTube, that this is the last time that we're going to see the Dinobots for the rest of the season until Transformers the movie. Not something that I knew, but I do want to thank that commenter as they've been commenting every week on the audio episodes on YouTube. So knowing that, it's kind of interesting seeing how the Dinobots were portrayed here. But we're going to start with non-robot thoughts. So because we have a 2-parter or a multi-parter here, we're getting the narrator, that iconic narrator recapping part 1. It always brings a smile to my face because it just has this nostalgic feel. It kind of gets you in the mood for what's going to happen. And even at my age, even though I know that this show, it doesn't age the way that I remember it as a kid, this narrator does age well and I love it. So in this episode, there is a subterranean transit system for Cybertron. And I said last episode that they didn't do enough in this season to give us Cybertronian history. So I think that adding something like that is a nice touch. Cybertron is a big planet, and even though the Transformers are big, they do need to travel fast across it. So something as utilitarian as a subterranean transit system, I think, is actually really cool. Now, of course, you have weird discrepancies with size because the humans seem to be small at times in the transit cars, but then size seems to be inconsistent as Swoop looks small, the humans look regular size. So, and that's just going to happen. I've come to grips with that fact. So, Spike, Carly, Swoop, they find themselves in the bowels of Cybertron, and much like the depths of the ocean, there are primitive systems that they found that seem to be alive and well, but had been untouched. This is another little nugget that I feel like adds depth to the planet as a whole, because we really have only seen surface level, and I mean that both literally and figuratively, of Cybertron. And so to go into the history even more in a physical sense, I thought was really neat. And I liked that they were watching old footage of the parts of Cybertron and what they used to be like. And again, they're going into great depth seeing this. And it's something that, again, is lacking throughout. We see how the war actually progressed. We know that the war is something that is a concept, and that's how we got here. But we rarely get to see what was lost because of the war. They don't show us what old Cybertron was. And I love it because it predates Optimus Prime and Megatron, at least according to these videos. However, of course, that movie time left them vulnerable to capture, but I think that it's important, at least from my perspective and for this podcast, that they showed us that even though it really didn't do the humans any favors. And speaking of the humans, Carly and Spike being so small compared to the Transformers in this sense gives them an advantage in moving around on Cybertron. It allowed them to easily escape, find Cybertron's central computer, and that's something, again, I talk about the discrepancy with size, but I do appreciate that because they used it to their advantage. It was something that was logical or reasonable, and I don't know if that's because Carly is with them, but it just so happened that they were able to move about the cabin freely, and I like that. Now, Carly does kind of F around and find out when she's attempting to override the central computer. Spike does tell her to be careful and not to touch anything, and by doing so, she falls and injures herself and kind of triggers a failsafe on the computer for it to shut down. This is a rare mistake that Carly makes because I said last time that she's a baddie and that she always delivers, and in this case, she got a little bit too big for her britches, if you want to say that. But in this scene, there is a little bit of a weirdness in that there's a human-sized ladder to escape. It seems awfully convenient. I mean, yes, again, it's a cartoon. It's way too small for any robot, and I just said that they are small compared to the Transformers. At least they've been shown that way on Cybertron. So for there to be a ladder that is just human size seems a little bit too convenient. But later on in the episode, despite her mistake earlier that gets her injured, she somehow comes out of it. They don't really explain how she's able to get better and move better, but she once again proves her worth by fixing the Dinobots. And in this scene, though, she does sort of like a caress of Spike's face, and it's almost in a snarky way. It tells me that she's into him, but it also kind of has friend zone vibes too. And I just thought to myself, she is so out of his league, and I don't care what anybody says. She is. Spike, up until this point, has basically messed up all the time, and so for her to be into him, he should just count his lucky stars and move on. And I mentioned earlier that Spike and Carly were made honorary Autobots after saving them with the Cybertonium, and this is, in my opinion, the first time that Spike hasn't messed up any of their plans. And I kind of like that because up until now, he's sort of been a nuisance, and now he is somebody that the Autobots can count on, and I like that. And speaking of the Autobots, this was obviously a Dinobot-heavy episode, and I think that the Dinobots saw a little bit of a change in them. So they're captured due to the numbers game when they get to Cybertron, and this all kind of fits into this humility thing because they wanted to do things on their own, and they just don't have enough experience to realize that this could happen. They needed to fail, and I think that that's great. And it, again, was a sign of them not being ready to be on their own. And I do think, though, that this whole encounter, being saved by the humans, being saved and having to save the Autobots, I think it was actually humbling because I think that Shockwave taking them over, it just wasn't something they thought about. And so Grimlock and crew has thought about it. They have an error in their ways and they acknowledge it and I think are humbled. And I think that this directly leads to a personality shift that we're not going to see until the movie. But I do think that this might be the first sign. Whether it's intentional or not, I don't know. Just something that I think maybe could be intentional. And from now on, the Dinobots are definitely seen more in a comedic role. And I think people probably associate them more with that than they do what we've seen up until this point. So the whole point of this two-parter is that the Autobots and Decepticons on Earth are lacking Cybertonium. And so at the end of this episode, after all the things happen, Carly and Spike end up saving the Autobots from the Cybertonium that they're missing, but we don't know what happens to the Decepticons, and I would assume that Shockwave was able to get them some because they were mining it in this episode. It's just a matter of the Autobots were not going to be able to get it because of this barrier that Shockwave and the Decepticons provided. It's just not explicitly shown, but we know that they're obviously going to get fixed, and so the Autobots are able to save their own lives, save their own skins, and fight on another day. It's just assumed that the Decepticons were able to do that. And speaking of the Decepticons, Shockwave was ready for Spike and Carly, and honestly, I like it that he doesn't hesitate in vaporizing Carly's car when they get there. I think I mentioned last episode, and I probably mentioned it before, that Shockwave is the gatekeeper, the caretaker for Cybertron for the Decepticons, but every single time an Autobot comes through the space bridge, they always manage to get through. So it's nice to see that even though they did get through, he's starting to not hesitate now. And it is what it is, though. He doesn't have a good track record with them getting away, and they always seem to escape. Whether it's humans, whether it's robots, it doesn't matter. But thankfully for him, not many Autobots make it over the space bridge successfully throughout the entirety of the season. So maybe, just maybe, it's not enough to kill him, and that's why Megatron keeps him alive. But Shockwave doesn't realize during all of this that he can disobey Megatron in his disabled form, because again, on Earth, all of the robots are disabled. And this speaks to the fact that Shockwave, much like Soundwave, is an unreasonably loyal soldier. He continues to do Megatron's bidding by sending the Sentinels after Spike and Carly. And I have to think that his unbridled loyalty comes out of something like fear, because Megatron doesn't rule with grace, he rules with fear. And so Shockwave misses an opportunity to take over for himself. And if it were Starscream in this role, 100% Megatron would be left for dead. And Shockwave, in continuing with this trend, he's always alone. And I feel like Shockwave, for all of his loyalty, is set up to fail. And he's set up to fail when it comes to protecting Cybertron. Megatron, for some reason, doesn't give him enough. He's doing this all by himself. And despite the fact that he has this planet at his disposal, the planet is depleted of energy. And so Shockwave in this episode is really the focus for the Decepticons. And he just doesn't do his job. I don't know what that means for him, but I feel bad for him because he's loyal. He tries to do everything Megatron asks of him. I think he's just set up to fail. Decepticons took over Cybertron, and so they branded everything them. But what's funny, and it's something I think I've pointed out, is that there's a color differentiation between Decepticon headquarters and Autobot headquarters, and that even exists on Cybertron. You see like dark grays, blacks, purple for Decepticons, which is what you saw outside of the lab with the Decepticon logo on it. And when you walk in, you get that gold color. So obviously the Decepticons hadn't been in the lab. They just branded all the buildings and maybe didn't know the lab was there. I don't know if that's a quirk or not. It's just something that I mentioned, and it could be, it couldn't be. So why not mention it here? How did I feel overall about this episode? I feel like the two-part episode does accomplish a lot in the fact that maybe it doesn't do anything for character development, but it does in terms of Cybertronian history, adding depth to the war. And it gives depth to the Dinobots' journey as they are humbled through all of this failure. And while we don't see them again until basically the movie, it still is nice to see. But I think the best part of this is getting a little bit more Cybertronian history, and hopefully that is a sign of things to come. If you've watched this episode recently, I would love to know. Instagram @EnerjonEntries is what you can search. You can also email me, mattyicemedia.com, with any comments and questions. There's a YouTube channel, so make sure to search and subscribe and all that stuff. I'd love to hear from people who listen on what kind of YouTube content they may want. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're good with the audio. But if you have some ideas, have some content that you like to see or hear my opinions on or my reviews of, let me know and I will try to make that happen for you. Next time, we're going to talk about Blaster Blues. That's going to be our review, episode 21. I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope this finds everybody well. Hope this finds everybody safe. And I'll talk to you next review. This is Energon Entries. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Energon Entries are those of Matt Freitz and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Energon Entries is exclusively owned by Matt Freitz and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.